Hey, everybody. Welcome to Pax Americana. I'm Julie Roginsky here with Olga Lautman. We're doing this on May Day today for the first time, which I'm so happy to have brought the show here as well, and also to all our friends on Substack who are following us and watching us there. Thank you so much. Olga, Donald Trump is winging his way back from what he calls a 12 out of 10 success summit in Asia, which I guess I'm not really sure what he was trying to accomplish there. I'm not sure what he accomplished there for the country. He accomplished quite a bit for himself. He got a gold crown out of the whole thing in South Korea. He got to hang out with his fellow dictator Xi Jinping without much to show for it. But what do you make of all this?
Honestly, I followed very little of his overseas trip besides the main headlines. Look, Trump is, we've known this for a decade. He manufactures crises and then steps in to try to solve his own crises. So apparently, from what I saw in the headlines, his major, tariff deal with China is lowering it down to, I think it's 47% now, which is 47% more than January or February.
Yeah.
I don't see where the success is in this. And the Chinese obviously know this. I mean, Xi Jinping, uh, runs a very tight regime. And he has Trump right where he needs him because he knows that Trump's only concern was not the security of Taiwan, not the security of Japan, not the security of South Korea, not the security of the United States, but to have headlines that say that he came up with some deals. That's all Trump cares, and that's it. And again, we are all paying more today than we were a year ago, than we were in January, than we were in February, until he started his erratic, tariff insanity, which is resulting we're all paying, So as he flaunts, he collected whatever $1 trillion in tariffs. Guess what? We paid the $1 trillion in tariffs. So congrats to America for.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the one thing he did do over there, which raises concern, is he ordered the Pentagon to resume nuclear weapons testing. We haven't had that since 1992, I believe. And he's doing that presumably because China is doing that and Russia is doing that. What do you make of that? He announced that it'll begin testing on an equal basis with Russia and China, which is as you point out, a 3-decade moratorium on explosive testing. And he made that hours before his meeting with Xi Jinping. Xi didn't seem to be overly concerned from the public perception, though we saw of him at that press conference next to Trump. Trump looked a little thirsty, and Xi looked like he, had zero reaction to any of this. But what do you make of that?
I honestly think this is a very interesting reaction to Russia. I don't think this has to do with China. It's interesting that Trump announced it, the night before he met with Xi. But Russia just, well, at least they claim they tested a nuclear, underwater, torpedo weapon. And I think this has to do directly with Russia, in response to Russia. Clearly, I think Trump maybe knows something more, as far as maybe his national security advisors, if we have any left. Maybe Marco Rubio filled him in, because this also comes, we'll cover it later, but it comes with Russia making an interesting move in Venezuela. I think it would have something to do with that.
What do you make of the there's constantly a rhetorical pivot, right? Russia does something outrageous. Trump kind of wags his finger, but then nothing really comes of it other than he wags his finger, right? Like he's saying he's going to impose all these sanctions on people who trade oil with Russia, but he's still not giving Ukraine the weapons that it needs. Zelensky went home empty-handed. It doesn't look like that's changing anytime soon. So, to me, this is all a bit of kabuki theater, but, you seem to imply that there's something more to this that Trump knows, that maybe it's not just kabuki theater for him.
With him, and I said, with him, it's very hard. During the first term, Russia had complete control over Trump. I mean, he was very new to government. He didn't know how the US government functioned. He was still concerned with Russia investigations, revealing something, and did everything he could to shut it down. So at that point, Russia still had control. They could threaten him. They could release compromise at the time. They had a whole slew of things. They even tested it a few times during his first term when he actually moved away from a policy shift that benefited them, which happened rarely, but it did. And they would, send a shots fired warning, like get back in line, and he would. But the second term, is very, very emboldened. Right now, I personally would say he's stronger than Putin. He's stronger than any leader in the world for the fact that he has a control of the U.S. military, which is the strongest in the world. And at this point, he has trained over the past decade too. He has trained his MAGA audience to basically dismiss any kind of news. So even if Russia were to release the most vile, him raping, 5, 10-year-olds, he would, pass it off as fake news. His base would back him, Fox News, and the whole MAGA media sphere would back him, and Republicans would all fall in line. So at this point, he has full control not only of America's military, to the point he didn't have this type of control in 2017 because he purged all the generals and threw in his own loyalists. Now, to carry out whatever orders he wants, he sidelined Congress, as we've seen in Venezuela. Even with Republicans, you have Republican senators who are sending in for, requests to the Pentagon on what is going on in Venezuela. And the Pentagon is completely ignoring not just Democratic senators, but Republican senators. So he, fully took control of the military and put everyone in and, top ranks that report to him. And he has full control of the Republican Party. So right now he could do whatever he wants, and this is why you see this back and forth. He gets on the phone with Putin, he gets pulled in his sphere, then he gets on the phone with Netanyahu, he gets pulled away from his from Russia's sphere, like we saw with Iran, towards Israel's sphere. Then whoever gets into his ear, this is where he moves. So even though we haven't seen, decisive action, there are still weapons flowing through NATO. They have purchased Patriot missile systems and various weapons, that are moving to Ukraine. They're arriving, on a weekly basis. They didn't get the Tomahawks, but at the same time, Europe is using, and Ukraine, they're using this time, at least as U.S. continues selling weapons, they're using this time while they themselves prepare for a potential, U.S. exit.
Well, and also preparing for potential Russian invasion, which I think they take a lot more seriously than anyone does around here. I want to switch over to what Putin is doing, because this is so you read this and your heart just stops. And I just want people to just take a moment before we get into this to just think about what it is that we're talking about. It's brutal. The Kyiv Independent, which is a great source of news and people should subscribe to it, they had an investigation that found that Russia is training Ukrainian children from the occupied regions, from the Donbass, for military service under a Kremlin-backed program. And it's run by something called the Warrior Center for Military and Patriotic Education. They have camps that teach teens combat drills, drone operations, and weapons handling. It's overseen by Russian officers and former Wagner mercenaries. They are effectively training Ukrainian children to fight against their own countrymen on behalf of their enemy. I mean, this would be akin to Nazis taking French children in 1942 and having them fight against France on the front lines, which is where this is going. And, just when you think it can't get more awful, I don't know how else to describe it, you see stories like this, Olga, and it's just it's
Infuriating.
infuriating, but it's also like I know that we are not a party to anything that happens at The Hague, but when this is over, and I hope it will be over soon, to say that we need Nuremberg style trials is not an understatement. And I know we always say that about Trump, but we're going to need Nuremberg. Like, we don't need that for Trump. Let's calm down. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission when this is all over with Trump, but we don't need a Nuremberg style trial. I don't know that we've needed Nuremberg style trials except for maybe what Milosevic was doing in back in Serbia and Yugoslavia back in the day. But what is happening now is so akin to Nazi Germany that I, who absolutely hates any analogies to the Nazis because there was only one Hitler, I'm starting to come to the conclusion that actually Putin, if given the power, would behave and is behaving exactly like Hitler behaved. With the genocide, with the war, with the civilian deaths, with the mercenaries who go behind the army and basically slaughter civilians. And in September, Olga, was the anniversary of Babi Yar. And if people don't know what Babi Yar is, I don't know what the Ukrainian pronunciation is. I'm using the Russian pronunciation, so I apologize. But Babi Yar is now part of Kiev, but during the war was a place just outside Kiev. I think the city's expanded now to include Babi Yar, and it was a ravine. And they took basically all of Kiev's Jews, and Kiev had a storied Jewish community going back centuries. I mean, centuries. Ukraine did. I'm Olga, I don't know if you're Ukrainian. Is your dad Ukrainian or your mom Ukrainian? Who's Ukrainian?
My dad.
Your dad, right? Who I believe is Jewish, right? My part of my family came from Ukraine before they went to Russia. It was all very fungible back then. But they took that entire community, they made them strip, they made them stand at the edge of that ravine, and they murdered them all. And Babi Yar is one of the great mass atrocities of World War II. People talk about Auschwitz a lot. Babi Yar was on par with that. The Russians, the Soviets then tried to cover it up after the war was over because they were also very anti-Semitic, so it never got the play that Auschwitz got. But Babi Yar was up there, maybe not on scale, but certainly in the scale of savagery. Putin is doing things that are like this. And taking these children and sending them to fight against their own families is akin to this. And these children have no choice. They have no choice. And, I have nothing more to say about this, Olga. I don't know if you want to chime in. What more is there to say?
The only thing there is to say that people really, across Europe and just in general, the international community really needs to wake up to this, because this is genocide. This is happening since 2014. I've been working on these issues since 2014 when Russia occupied Donbass and invaded and annexed Crimea. They have been stealing children. They have been forcing, Ukrainians in occupied territory to go to the front lines. It was just done on a smaller scale. Europe acted, as business as usual from 2014. Obama was absent. He literally did nothing besides put a few sanctions. And I mean, this was really the second time since post-World War II that Russia invaded a sovereign country. First was Georgia, and then you had in 2014 Ukraine. So this was happening. There were concentration camps set up in Crimea. There were concentration camps set up in Donbass. There were children being kidnapped from these regions, the younger ones, and sent to Russia to re-education camps. And had their Ukrainian heritage erased, and then, replaced with Russian heritage, and then who knows what happened. Some got donated to Russian families, others, we don't know where it went, where they went. But this all exploded in 2022. And now you have it on such a mass level. First off, after the full-scale invasion in 2022, after Russia started grabbing, more territory, they started sending Ukrainians, and again, this is genocide. They started sending Ukrainians under gunpoint in Russian-occupied territories to the front line to kill Ukrainians. And then they kidnapped tens of thousands of children. Now, Ukrainians have approximately 21,000 plus names of children, that they've collected evidence on that were kidnapped. Yale study lab, Yale lab. Has been working on this, also compiling evidence. They have around 8 to 9,000 names of Ukrainian.
And if I could just interrupt for a second, Olga, sorry. If you recall, when Trump first came in, they tried to get rid of that file.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's very important for people to know. Yale had been compiling these names since the start of the war of these missing children. These are children.
And more than names.
Yes, more like who
investigations where they are inside of Russia to try to, get them back. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the Trump administration tried to erase that file, literally tried to erase that file. And it was only after tremendous outcry that they backpedaled. Marco Rubio, who was a huge proponent of this as senator, Secretary of State, oversaw almost the erasure of this. Had it been gone, there's no way to have gotten these kids back. And you have to ask the question, again, why did the Trump administration, of all the things they wanted to do, why was in the first days of the new administration, why did they try to erase those files? I mean, anytime anybody thinks about what Putin has on Trump, ask that basic question. Why in the world would you want to get rid of a file of missing children and where they are and how to locate them, the only file that exists? Why would we, the United States, which last I checked, pretends to be on the side of righteousness and democracy, work to do that kind of evil, awful stuff? We can talk about that in our but I didn't
a while ago. Yeah. But and just to add that file was in the process of being transferred to European law enforcement because they are compiling criminal cases against Russians for kidnapping these children. So Yale has been working on this issue for years. I know the head of this project, and I've, he's doing an amazing job. I'm so grateful to him. Ukraine has been compiling this between Ukrainian civil society and prosecutor's office and the ombudsman for missing children. And with Ukraine, there's a list of 21 plus thousand. And then you bring in Russia. What do you think Russia did? Did they deny this? No, they said 700,000 they stole. This is what they said. Several Duma members have made comments. A few said 700,000 plus Ukrainian children they stole, except they don't say stole. They say, quote unquote, rescued. And then you have others who say 250,000. So, I mean, if you would think, Russia would hide this genocide, but no, they actually speak about it. And Malofeyev, his wifey, Belova, she who has an arrest warrant for her role in the orchestrating this kidnapping, at least part of it. She was just on Russian TV, yet again admitting that she kidnapped children. She took a few for herself and Malofeyev, and admitted, yet again that she's kidnapping. Now, this is genocide. You cannot take any population during a war and pick up this population and displace them into another country. This is genocide, and this is what The Hague has been working on. They issued arrest warrants for war crimes as far as with the children, but I mean, this meets the, legality of genocide. So never again has been happening again over and over. And, US has checked out. Europe, they are there, but I mean, there needs to be a more forceful response to this from the international community, particularly that it's been happening now over a decade.
Well, meanwhile, the Russians are not containing themselves just to Ukraine.
Nope.
Polish jets intercepted Russian spy planes, another Russian spy plane over the Baltic for the second day this week. It scrambled. Poland had to literally scramble two MiG-29 fighter jets. Ironically, I think those are Russian fighter jets, but to intercept a Russian Il-20 reconnaissance aircraft that was flying without a transponder or flight plan, of course. What do you think that might have been, Olga? Over the Baltic Sea. The second incident in 2 days, and it was a spy plane, obviously linked to Russia's electronic intelligence operations, remained international airspace. It led to obviously NATO heightened alert levels because Russia continues to do this, and every time the Western media either ignores it or says, oh, maybe it was an accident. We have GPS these days, my friends. It is no accident. You just don't happen to fly over, no more than my GPS will so happen to take me to Ohio if I'm going to Boston. It just doesn't, as we all know from having GPS. So, look, I think the problem here is a lack, and my friend Michelle Kinney, who's one of the people here at Mayday, always says this, a lack of imagination. And especially here in the United States, we have a lack of imagination about how bad things can get because we have a very short memory and things have not gotten bad here except for September 11th, since really Pearl Harbor. But the Europeans don't have a lack of imagination because you go to any European, especially in Eastern Europe, any European city, village, town, and you will either have people who are still alive or people who were raised like mother's milk on stories, as you and I were, Olga, on stories of World War II. So for those of us who were born after World War II, those memories, though they're not our own, are still very prevalent. And the Europeans understand this, and they understand this was no accident. And so they are covering this very effectively. We here in the United States apparently don't quite believe that Putin can actually purposely send fighter jets or spy planes, over NATO countries. We tend to think maybe they went off course or their GPS was messed up. I mean, we twist ourselves into pretzels to either ignore this or to give this man a pass.
Well, this is a problem with U.S. foreign policy, and this again goes further than Trump and deeper than Trump and across several administrations. If you admit something, then you have to respond. And if you put your head in the sand and say, no, nothing to see, we don't know what happened, then you don't have to have a response. And there's not one president here since Reagan who has wanted to confront Russia. We had, very notable attacks. What were they called? The attacks on our CIA and FBI, the Havana syndrome attacks. There was evidence that came from the intelligence community. I know a few CIA operatives who have been hit with these attacks. And know that this was, an attack, that this wasn't just random. I don't feel well today, and that's it. And what did the Biden administration do? They buried it. They buried the report. They didn't want it to come out because if you admit that Russia is attacking our intelligence community, they were brazen enough on a secret trip that no one knew with the former CIA Director Burns to go into, I forgot where, I think he was traveling to Pakistan at the time. They were brazen enough to try to get him, but they managed to get his staff. They missed him with this attack, but managed to get their staff. Also an FBI officer in Florida. So again, this is just one example. And here, no one wants to deal with Russia. They, for some reason, have this bizarre view of Russia, from the 1970s and 80s, which arguably, again, I don't agree with, but at that point they treated Russia as a superpower, and it was like a clash between two superpowers, United States and Russia. They still view Russia in the same way. And as a result, they hesitate. And then add the, failure of our media, which pretty much is the answer to everything, because our media doesn't get into this. Very rarely, unless something happens. I can promise you, not CNN, definitely not MSNBC, not Fox News. No one has covered that Polish jets, intercepted a spy plane, that it's happened twice, that Lithuania is under a freaking balloon attack. Already 30 plus balloons that keep crossing the border from Belarus, supposedly cigarettes, but this is to test NATO responses from the Belarus border. No one is covering this in the United States, and this is a problem, because when Americans wake up one day and realize, like, wait a minute, why is Europe in a full scale war, and how did we miss this? You can, easily say, unless you watched our show and a handful of other people who monitor the region, everyone else will be blind to it and will be literally oblivious into how this all happened and how a full scale war, eventually might break out in Europe.
I mean, look, let's just be very clear. As this is happening, Russia's ally, I wouldn't even say ally, Russia's vassal, client state, I don't know how to describe it, Belarus, which
Because annexed territory, it belongs to Russia.
I'm even surprised they're still independent. I would have thought by now they would have voluntarily, or at least their leader voluntarily.
Russia doesn't want to pay pensions to.
Yeah, but they have this puppet Lukashenko, who's basically
exactly,
like an autocrat dictator who I think has been there, right, Olga, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like, this guy's
90s, 94, 95.
He's been in office for 30 years or more. And Lukashenko does whatever Putin wants. And it's convenient because they're also on the Ukrainian border. And so I urge, whenever we talk about this, I truly urge everybody to just look at a map of Europe, and specifically Eastern Europe. Everything we say will make a lot more sense to you.
And not to cut you off, just to add, not only are they on Ukraine's border, but Russia literally moved military equipment and troops for the full-scale 2022 invasion. So all the tanks that got stuck, the column we were watching going up to Kiev, that came from Belarus.
Right.
So it's, not just there. They're literally Russia's expanded military playing field now.
Right. So Lithuania closed its border with Belarus, and it's now saying that it's going to keep its border closed. And again, Lithuania, a NATO country. Look at the geography of where that is, right? In the Baltics. Also very close to Ukraine, very close to Poland. Has changed. Poor Lithuania has been Russian Empire. It's been part of Poland. Also incredibly incredible. Lithuania is very much like Ukraine, where they've just been occupied by so many people over the course of their history. But it will keep its border closed at least until November 30th, after waves of cigarette-filled balloons repeatedly violated its airspace, forcing airport shutdowns. Vilnius, which is the capital of Lithuania, called the incident part of a hybrid attack linked to state-sponsored smuggling from Belarus. Well, of course, Belarus is not doing this on its own. Belarus couldn't sneeze without getting permission from Putin, or even have the ability to sneeze without getting permission from Putin. So this, again, another NATO country. They're continuing to chip away and chip away and chip away. And very much like Trump, who, will do something to see what the reaction is so that he can go further next time. They are testing NATO. They are testing NATO. And, I think their thought is NATO going to invoke Article 5 for something like a Baltic nation? Can people in the United States even identify where Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania is on the map? And the answer is, I don't think that Trump would ever go to war for any of these countries. I don't think he'd go to war for Poland. And so the question is, does NATO still exist? And the answer is, I don't think so. It exists on paper, but without the United States agreeing to collective defense, I don't know what the solution is.
Well, look, NATO is going to protect European security regardless what happens. And, if it's not NATO, it'll be PATO or MATO. All they have to do is rearrange some of the letters, give it a new name, and minus the United States, because European
Well,
security has to be defended. I mean, they're not going to sit there and say, well, U.S. is not, helping us, and we can rely on the U.S. If Article 5 is invoked. So therefore, we're just going to lay down and die and let Russian tanks and drones and everything else come. And this isn't just Lithuania and Estonia. Russia has sent drones to sensitive military sites in Sweden, in Norway, in Finland, in Germany, in France. I mean, I can go on and on and on. Over the past 2 months, everything that Russia has done to escalate against specifically NATO countries. And they understand that Russia may be preparing for war. I mean, so will they have to invoke it? I mean, we'll see how far Russia pushes, but eventually every single European intelligence and defense agency has the same assessment that as early as 2027 to as late as 2030, the timing is off by a few years, that Russia will attack a NATO country. As far as with the US, I mean, like I said earlier, they keep praising Trump. You had the Secretary General, who came running here. Oh, Trump, you're a genius. Last time he called him my daddy. But they're doing everything as at the same time they're increasing weapons production. Germany has really, really ramped up their weapons productions in order to try to replace U.S. weapons. France has done the same. So they're taking it seriously. Obviously, the closer you are to, and unfortunate you are to be Russia's neighbor, the more you're being prepared. I mean, I could tell you not NATO, the Baltics have been building trenches along their border since the full-scale invasion. So they started preparing very early in the case of a potential Russian invasion. They teamed up with Finland and Sweden in order to have, a security kind of a blanket across the borders. Then you have Poland, who we know how Poland feels. Even before any invasions, I, grew up with a lot of Poles in the 80s and 90s in Brooklyn. You mentioned Russian at that point, or even speak Russian, they're ready to rip your head off. Rightfully so, after what Russia has done to Poland. So they have absolutely no love for Russia, and they have no fear of Russia, because they've already, every country literally that may confront Russia has already been in the situation over the past decades, at one point or another. So Poland is, preparing. They even are mobilizing people, fortifying their borders with Belarus, and whatnot. So they're taking the preparations. What happens in Brussels, and that they have defense meetings constantly, these useless meetings, that's a different story. But as far as with the countries, I mean, even Germany has ramped up their not only warnings, but also their warnings to the citizens in Germany to say, like, wake up, because we may soon, be in a war with Russia. And the UK is the same way. And that's it. So again, everyone is preparing outside of U.S. No one actually believes Trump will run to help anyone if it happens before, in the next before 2030. I mean, we don't know how long Trump could be in office. I mean, until 2040, 2050.
We hear Mayday talk about that all the time. We don't think he's leaving, but I will say that
we're fortunate. We are fortunate because when Putin seized power, what was he, in his 50s or 40s? 40s. Imagine. I mean, Trump, thank God, is like at 80. So we're very fortunate. At least we're not going to have a Putin type situation just simply because Trump is older.
His dad did live to be around 100. Just want to caution. Anyway, so I will say this to your point, that the United States is abandoning Europe and is abandoning NATO. Our friend Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, I refuse to say war, although they're spoiling very hard for a war, is pulling the 2nd Infantry Brigade combat team of the 101st Airborne Division. The 101st, of course, is the elite, one of the elite airborne divisions. They're pulling them out of Romania. They're not replacing them. Of course, this is a huge reduction in U.S. forces on NATO's eastern flank. Even have Republicans complaining about it as weakening deterrence against Russia, especially in light of these flights that Russia continues to do over Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Romania, and several other countries. I would note that all of those countries were either directly in the Soviet Union or certainly part of the Warsaw Pact, which Putin believes surely should belong to him or his sphere of influence again. And, they are doing what they said they were going to do. I mean, one of the first things Hegseth said when he first became Secretary of Defense is that they were going to focus on the threat in Asia, I guess, against China, which I have yet to see that happening. He's about to give away our, NVIDIA AI technology to the Chinese in exchange for China buying a few soybeans. But he's also and also focusing on the Western Hemisphere, which they certainly have been by blowing up boats without any kind of legal authority all over the Caribbean and the Pacific. But they basically told Europe that they're on their own, and they're going through with it. And so I do want to be very clear that listen, to this administration's credit, if I can put it that way, they do what they say they're going to do, no matter what the outcry is, no matter what anybody says.
Yep.
And the outcry here was that they want this gone. They want United States military forces out of Europe. I'm curious to see what happens in places like Ramstein in Germany. And, those are our biggest bases. Italy, we have bases all over Europe that have been there for the last 80 years after the end of the World War II as a deterrent against a Russian invasion. And for whatever reason, I will let people here draw their own conclusions. We are not doing that anymore and allowing the Russians to have effectively, without European help, if the Europeans don't do what they're going to do, effectively, they can just roll the tanks over the border into Poland. That would not be hard for them to do. I don't think they'd be very successful because they can't even roll their tanks into Ukraine. I don't think Europe, a raid against Russia would be good for Russia. It wouldn't be a great outcome, but nevertheless, it would be a catastrophic outcome. It would be World War III. And it doesn't have to be nuclear to be World War III, but it would be World War III with now the threat of nukes hanging over you. I would say it's very similar to Game of Thrones, which I talked about this morning. I don't know if people here watch Game of Thrones, but it would basically be like fighting all those wars, knowing you have the dragons circling overhead that you could potentially unleash. You don't want to do that. And you don't want to give the Russians any cause to think that they can do that. And yet, that's effectively what the signal is to Russia, which I would argue again bodes ill for anybody who wonders why Trump does everything that Putin wants. I don't care about his rhetoric, Olga, and how he's threatening and wagging his finger to Vladimir Putin. What he's doing is, Putin couldn't have dreamed of this. We've talked about this before. If I designed the perfect robot to bring down the United States and help Russia, if sometime in 1947, or whenever the hell Trump was born, 46, 47, if somebody in Lubyanka, which is the KGB headquarters, sat down and somehow had the tools to design the perfect child who would then grow up to become president of the United States to help back then Joseph Stalin make good on his threat to conquer the West, they could not have done a better job than Donald Trump.
No, absolutely, because between him and not only, abandoning Europe, but at the same time, all his foreign policy decisions. And the one thing that is important to note for the millionth time is that There potentially may be a joint agreement between Russia and China that Russia goes into Europe and that China goes after Taiwan. This could have been arranged. The Europeans are aware of this. Finally, the NATO secretary, finally, after years of warning about this from a few people who think out of the box, finally has mentioned this possibility of a joint um, setting off of wars where Russia goes further, into Europe, and simultaneously China goes after Taiwan. So we are really going into very a dangerous situation, and I'm not as worried about tanks because Russia. I mean, if you see the inventory of tanks they have left, I mean, they really pulled back like to the 1940s to yank out tanks out of like museums to use for Ukraine.
Yeah.
My worry is drones because Russia has really, just like Ukraine, has re-engineered war with drones and using different type of drones and perfecting drones and creating new capabilities on drones to the point that Ukraine has left the United States in the dust. Russia has been doing the same, and Russia actually now is on par with Ukraine as far as drone production inside of Russia, because initially Iran was supplying the Shahed drones for them. And then Iran sent their engineers both to Crimea and inside of Russia to help set up this, drone production. Now Russia's producing drones after drones and glide bombs, which is another, whole set of problems. So my worry is them overwhelming, European countries with drone attacks, which cost nothing compared to like more sophisticated ballistic missiles, and will really put Europe on a war footing. I mean, that's it. If you start getting bombed by drones, welcome to Kiev and Kharkiv and Kherson and every other part that gets bombed with 600 to 800 drones per night. I mean, Kiev, now Russia, since August, has increased the drone attacks just against, for instance, Kiev, upwards of 6 to 800. You can imagine one city. It's like New York City having 6 to 800 drones hitting it every single night. These were not the numbers before August. And my worry is not only are they doing this for Ukraine and, hitting residential buildings, kindergartens, hospitals, you name it. I mean, as long as it's Ukrainian people, they're, that's a primary target. But also, they may be testing for overwhelming Estonia's airspace, Germany's airspace, France's airspace, any NATO country. And then, easily when Russia says it's a go, launch drones against a European country.
Well, and that brings us to this next thing that we want to talk about, which is that German intelligence services are warning that Russia is recruiting low-level agents, who are typically just ordinary civilians, ordinary, I guess, German civilians or whoever they can get their hands on, who are being paid a small amount of money, not much, to carry out sabotage, vandalism, surveillance missions. They're people who are either radicalized or financially motivated, and there's certainly a lot of if you've ever gone to Russia, the number of Russian media is so prevalent in Germany. In the original Russian, there are a tremendous amount of Russian immigrants who live there, but also not just people who are Russian immigrants, but it is unabated. I mean, you could watch that stuff in Russian 24/7 and only get Putin's point of view on this, and you become radicalized that way. And I don't know why the Germans allow this to happen, but they do. In any case, these operatives are either radicalized or they just need a few bucks, or I should say a few euros, through pro-Russia Telegram channels, through pro-Russian television. They're part of a wider hybrid campaign involving drone incursions and propaganda to destabilize Germany, and that is happening in Germany now. So again, understand the largest country in Europe is facing this as well.
And this is again a growing problem that Europeans do not. I remember in 2023 speaking with a few European officials, and they don't know how to get their hands around this because this started, towards the end of 2022, where Russia wanted to increase their attacks against other European countries, between arson attacks, between attacks on telecommunications and other critical infrastructure, between espionage attacks, taking photos of local military bases and whatnot. And they started using Telegram channels to recruit local people. And it's very hard to catch because, it's one thing if you have a cell of operatives moving, from Russia to Kazakhstan, then moving into other European countries, you can kind of track it. You might get intelligence on it, but it's a different story when you just put out an open call and, Telegram channels, and then you don't know what happens, who's having private DMs, who responded to this. They were doing the same thing. I was tracking a few Americans who Wagner was recruiting in the United States to send former military people to send to which they did send to Russia. They went to Russia and then joined their forces to go into Ukraine to fight Ukrainians. So this is a growing problem. This is a very, very big problem. And it's not just for espionage or arson attacks or telecommunications or giving information, for where drones, for instance, should fly over to collect critical information. It's also a problem for, escalating culture wars. Because if you remember in France, after October 7th, there was, increasing swastika attacks drawn. Yeah. Guess what? It ended up being, I believe, if I'm correct, I hope
correct. It turned out to
be
it
was a Romanian couple who were hired by Russians to carry out this. I hope I'm correct as far as that it was Romanians. I'm pretty sure, or maybe Bulgarians or Romanians.
The point is, it was behind. The point, it doesn't matter.
They got their instructions from Russia.
Yeah.
And that's it. Yeah. So it's not just for military, operations. It's also for culture wars. And we've seen how Russia's culture wars can escalate, because I'll never forget in Sweden, like a decade ago, I believe, when someone burned the Quran, and it ended up being that this was a Russian operation in order to spark off a race war inside of Sweden. So, this is a big problem that is happening, and it's much harder to track. And this is something we need to keep an eye on, because Russia tests these attacks. First, they did the same in Ukraine. This is an old tactic that they were doing in Ukraine in the 2000s. Then they shifted to Moldova, where they've been recruiting people in Moldova, sending them to Wagner paramilitary camps in order to send them back to send off incendiary devices and violent protests and whatever. Now they're testing it across Europe over the past year. And this is something we need to keep an eye on, because with all the chaos happening in the United States, it's very easy for Russia to recruit again and radicalize Americans online to go and carry out attacks. And that will align with Trump's expansion of power, Insurrection Act, martial law, and everything else. So something we need to monitor as Americans also, because this tactic will appear here if it already hasn't. I suspect it has.
So I want to bring it back here to the Western Hemisphere, to our friends watching in Australia. I know there are a few I see in the chat here. You stay in your continent because it seems to be very nice and peaceful as opposed to our hemisphere here in the West and also Europe. We have been, Olga, I guess, fighting some sort of proxy shadow war with Maduro over in Venezuela over the last couple of weeks. I don't know what that's all about, other than I guess we want the oil. But I mean, Maduro is an awful human being, and he's a despot, and he is there illegally, and he lost his election, and he occupies a presidential seat that he should not occupy. All of that being said, there are a lot of people like Maduro around the world. So it's fascinating that we are now blowing boats off the coast of Venezuela under the pretense that they are drug runners, the drugs that come into the United States. If we want to start with that, we should probably start blowing up boats outside China or Mexico, because that's where the drugs come from. But nevertheless, that is what our president is saying to us. Anyway, as a result of all of this, a Russian Ilyushin Il-76 transport plane linked to the Russian military and sanctioned firm Aviacon Zerotrons, landed in Caracas after a multi-stop route through allied nations in Africa. The flight as Trump escalates military operations and moves more military equipment to the region. So the Russians are now, I guess, on the side of Venezuela and Maduro, and we're now fighting a proxy war with Russia, I guess, or I don't know what Putin is doing over there. I don't know what message he's sending to Trump, maybe to say that if you are going to get yourself bogged down in Ukraine, we're going to get you bogged down in Venezuela. This is a fascinating development to me, because
waiting for like a month and a half. I literally track Russian Telegram military channels waiting for any kind of Russian move, and finally it has come, because I knew it was coming. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, yes, but it's fascinating. I mean, this is how a lot of wars began, right? We fought Vietnam as a proxy war against the Russians. We fought Korea as a proxy war against the Chinese and also the Russians. There are many proxy wars that this country has fought against countries that were not the places where we were fighting wars. Are we at war with Venezuela? I don't think we're at war with them yet, but we continue to engage in behavior that I think is incredibly illegal. I don't know what else to say, with all the caveats that Maduro's an awful guy. So is Putin, so is Xi, so is Orban, so are so many other people. But for some reason, we are now choosing to go to war against Venezuela, or at least to get into some sort of conflict with them. I think I have to believe that this is just Putin sending a message that you're going to screw around or even consider sending Tomahawks or other missiles or other weapons to Ukraine. We're going to make your life complicated here on your side of the world as well. I can't imagine what other reason this is, unless there's something that Trump did that displeased his master, Vladimir Putin, and that's another sign that he should cut it out. So keep an eye on this one, I think, because this one is it will tell the tale, both when the Russians leave, if they do leave, see what happens in Ukraine with respect to the United States right before that happens, or if they stay, see what Trump's reaction is going to be. I suspect Trump will blink like he always blinks with Putin, but you tell me what you think, Olga.
This, to me, like I said, I've been waiting and waiting and waiting for this, to the point that, like, I monitor, every Russian military channel for any kind of movements, discussions, and whatnot. And I was waiting, and it finally did happen. So Venezuela and Russia are extremely close. I mean, right. This is something that they are beyond close, as far as close as you can get, to sociopaths, like the people who run the Kremlin. There's no true loyalty. Assad learned a very good lesson. He, is another Kremlin collectible sitting under Russia's security services, after losing control in Syria. But it's interesting because Russia and Venezuela are close, and like Russia is with Iran. This is not only, Venezuela like a proxy client of Russia's, but it was around, I believe, 2018 or 19 when Trump was in office the first term, that Russia decided to send a message to the United States and threatened that it was going to send its Iskander nuclear missiles to put in an island off of Venezuela. Venezuela at the time said, yes, absolutely, you can have your military base here and whatnot. This development is going to be very interesting to see, because Trump is taking us to a war. And it really is mind-boggling how the U.S. media, again, mentions Venezuela things, but no one is really digging into, are we going into war? Because if Trump thinks that Venezuela is going to be a walk in the park, this is Afghanistan times I would say times three, because one, you have the Maduro forces there that Trump would be fighting. Two, you have the Cuban military that Americans would be fighting. You have the mercenaries, you have the, how you call it, drug cartels, and now he's picking a fight with Colombians. So you effectively would have Colombian drug cartels, and the list goes on and on. The Russians now, mind you, Maduro has mobilized 1 million man. We'll see what happens. 1 million man army, and is using, getting all the equipment, every single piece of equipment that is going to be used against America is Russian. I mean, literally every single thing. Their planes, their tanks, their everything. And so now the fact that they send these people, I'm curious to see if they are preparing to assist Maduro in staying, or if they're preparing to exfiltrate Maduro in the case something happens. Because in 2019, when Maduro faced protest, you had a few FSB planes, which is Russia's security services, fly in, and they actually put together a plan. First of all, the planes were filled with senior level FSB officers plus Wagner mercenaries. And they came to Maduro's aid, put in a plan to quell the protests, to move Venezuela's gold from Venezuelan bank to Russia's central bank in the case the regime falls. But they did everything with the point, they had the backup in the case, but their main objective was to keep Maduro in power. And this was in 2019. You had arguably, over the past years, even though Wagner doesn't exist as much, the people still do, even though they shifted now under a different name, who have been operating in Venezuela. So my thing to watch with this is, one, if Russia will assist U.S. They just publicly signed a defense pact, or with Venezuela a few days ago, which again, it's worth nothing, as with everything that comes out of the regime's mouth, because they did the same thing with Iran. And guess what? When Iran got bombed by U.S. and Israel, Russia was nowhere to be found. The only thing they were worried about was keeping their nuclear scientists in Iran safe, and calling Israel, say, don't bomb this nuclear plant because our scientists, which I believe 600 or 700 of them, are sitting in this plant. So we don't want any international incidents, so avoid bombing this plant. That's the only concern Russia had. So here we'll see, again, publicly they signed a pact with Venezuela, which is pretty much as good as toilet paper. We'll see what happens, if this is to exfiltrate Maduro, or if the Russians are really preparing him and coordinating with the Chinese, with the Cubans. And arguably, again, the Cuban military is very powerful. Like, this is not a military you'd want to go against, especially with all the other forces and the type of region, fighting that there would be in that country. Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned. That's actually very interesting. And then finally, since we're here in the Western Hemisphere talking about this, I don't know what to make of the story. Something about this sounds weird, but there's a Russian honeypot who was a former sexpionage, is what they call her, named Alia Rosa. Again, the name itself is a little doesn't ring true to me. She revealed that Moscow-trained agents are targeting tech executives through romance scams to extract trade secrets. She described manipulative tactics such as stage encounters, love bombing, and fake social media identities to build trust before coercing information. This came from the New York Post, so take it with a grain of salt. I read that story a few days ago, Olga, and I thought, okay, this is a great tabloid story. But, the tactics she describes sound reasonable, in that you never make the first approach. You kind of, run into somebody 5 or 6 times before you make the connection, and so on. And certainly you have that. You have sexpionage happening. Honeypots happen all the time. And there's a whole Russian division that is established specifically more honeypots in all of
Mhm.
the intelligence agencies. Um, you know, do they have people compromised who work at NVIDIA or in any of these other AI really interesting places where the technology could be used for dual purpose? The answer probably is they're probably trying. But I don't, what do you make of the story?
It is interesting. It's definitely a warning to someone. I'm curious to what. It came out for a reason. And I'm not so sure who it's.
Out of the New York Post for a reason.
It came out of the New York Post for a reason, and it came out for a reason. I'm not so sure if it's a former honeypot, a current honeypot, because, once you go into intelligence agencies, very rarely, if you defect, you usually go into witness protection. And, or, if you are providing intelligence and have a new name, if you defect and just as a public person, with pushing back against the regime, then you obviously you live your life out normally, but still, get some sort of protection. In this case, it's very interesting. I remember I had interviewed years ago, almost a decade ago, Oleg Kalugin, who's the head of the former head of Russia's KGB counterintelligence service. He was like the second in command as far as for this, for the KGB, for this specific directorate. And I'll never forget, he said one of the most important things that, in Russia, we train our women to lie on their backs for their mother countries. He was talking about the KGB unit that specifically trained women to compromise men. At one point, it was used internally to root out dissent and to compromise people that if anyone was pushing back against, at the time, the communist regime, that and they would suddenly have information leaked of some kind of a grainy video or something, of them doing something improper. And then in the like 90s, it shifted to oligarchs within Russia, but also they started shifting around the 80s towards the United States, actually arguably earlier 70s, but 80s where it really like became a pattern.
You and I have always had questions about Ivana Trump, but go on.
Exactly. I mean, there are so many of these sort of cases. I have questions about quite a few people around. This got moved to SVR now for the most part, or overseas. If it's in one of the former hostage.
Sorry to interrupt. SVR is domestic, not domestic, excuse me, civilian. It's basically like their CIA, whereas GRU is their military. Their military intelligence arm. So for people who don't know, that's what SVR is. It's basically the successor to the KGB. But go on.
Yeah, when the KGB split, it went into SVR, which is Russia's Foreign Intelligence Services, equivalent to our CIA, and the FSB, which is Russia's domestic foreign intelligence, although they have counterintelligence operations.
Oh, like FBI.
It's more on countries that were formerly held hostage by the Soviet Union, whereas SVR focuses more on the rest of Europe, across the United States, Canada, and whatnot. So the story, I mean, is absolutely true. And I remember at the time, like Russia used these operations, the KGB, when they were looking for technological secrets, specifically from, people in MIT and Columbia University, and anything that had to do with technology, military, and whatnot. Then it got expanded. AI, I can tell you for, decades, this is the central thing that has been part of Russia's intelligence services to get as much information on AI. This is, going back to even if you read reports in the 90s, this is their main focus. They know which direction this is moving. This is the same equivalent to how they were focused on getting, computers and information on computers at one point and internet. So, long story short, Silicon Valley being targeted. This is absolutely believable. Why she's coming out? Is this a warning shot to somebody? There's more to the story. What she's describing is 100% correct. This is what's happening. And yes, all of Silicon Valley is under sex espionage attack. It has been for decades. And I mean, even one of the people we wrote in our active measures series, what's his name? Constantine. My God, how did that fly out of my name? Rykov. He came here in the 90s under a name called, I believe, John Forsman or James or something like that. He came to the U.S. in the 90s specifically to get information on Silicon Valley and everything, and then ended up going back to Russia and setting up this type of operations there and companies, and practically became at that point the godfather of internet, and then transitioned even into like the creation of bots and trolls and everything separate from Prigozhin, but he had his own operation with bots and trolls and doing everything for domestic purposes to prop up the Putin regime. So yes, I believe it. I'm curious why. Who are they warning to, get back in line?
I mean, as you so aptly said, and we should probably wrap it up, you don't just say something like this. You don't go to Donald Trump's favorite tabloid. Now, I don't know if they shopped this around to others and nobody else took it. Of course, this is so on par with what the New York Post would publish anyway, so maybe it's just that they couldn't get it anywhere else. But I think it's fascinating, fascinating.
I think they got it published also in the British outlet a few weeks ago.
I'm sure.
I remember first seeing it there and then seeing it in the New York Post. And like,
yeah, maybe the Daily Mail got it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is they got it published in the tabloids. And as Olga pointed out, you don't just go ahead and say that and then expect to keep living your life. Like once you learn, if they're going to go to the trouble of putting you through sex school, whatever it's called, over there and send you out of here and teach you all their trade secrets, they're not going to just suddenly say, okay, like it's not a job at McDonald's that you quit to go work at Burger King. And you just certainly don't go public with what you know. So you're absolutely right. This is clearly
not at this level, not a sex espionage like trainee. Right. If it was like the head of the department, then yes, maybe he would come under the complete protection of FBI here and speak publicly as Oleg Kalugin has and others. Not a trainee. A trainee would end up in the river in Hudson if she ever attempted to say anything like this.
Exactly right. Okay. On that note, we've been at this for more than an hour. You guys, thank you. We actually have the biggest audience we ever had for the show between Substack and here on YouTube. So we are so grateful to everybody for sticking with us today. We will be back right here and also on Substack, either at the Mayday Network on YouTube or on Substack at Olga's and my Substacks both at 11 a.m. Eastern next Thursday. In the meantime, Michelle and I will see you at 8 a.m. Eastern tomorrow for our TGIF. Thank goodness it's Friday morning show, which Olga's going to come and co-host with us, whether she likes it or not. One of these days, we're going to have her come in and do it with us. We're going to drag her. And we are also going to see you, Olga and I, for our Active Measures series on Substack at, what are we doing, Olga? I'm so confused with the time.
12:30 p.m. Eastern time.
On Tuesdays. Look out for that newsletter to hit your newsletter inboxes on Substack, and Olga's and I both on Monday. And on that note, everybody have a great weekend. Yes.
Just add, I pulled all the links for the stories since we talked about so many of them. So Julie and I, with our respective Substacks, will send the show notes for this with all the links if you want to read more on the topic.
So for people on YouTube who are not familiar with Olga's and my Substack, I am over at Salty Politics. On Substack, Olga is at Unmasking Russia and the Trump Tyranny Tracker. She's got two. You should subscribe to both. They're both amazing must-read Substacks. And we will see you all. Olga and I will see you next week. And Michelle and I will see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. Eastern. All right, everybody. Have a great weekend. And we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.